Good evening, guys. So, small change in format. I've now got a laptop, I've got a webcam, so hopefully this will make it look a little bit better. Obviously, at the minute, I'm not in the lorry. I'm recording this Sunday night, so I'm just at home at the minute. But fingers crossed, this will make the quality while I'm out a little bit better. There's not too much I can actually do about it if it doesn't. I'm stuck with this setup for a while now because I haven't really got the money to do anything else. But I think this should be better than just recording it on my phone. So today we're going to be talking about transfers and more rather than transfers specifically, more to do with Newcastle's transfer policy in general. This is because I've seen a lot of people asking why we haven't had any youth signings yet. Like Dan Ashworth isn't doing his job and that sort of thing. So I just wanted to address that really. So I mean, we'll take it. We'll go with more recent developments first. Obviously, Almiron and Lascelles both missed Saturday's game against Fulham. Yeah, I don't know. I don't mind if they leave as long as we get a replacement. So my question would be, can we get a replacement in time? And it wouldn't surprise me if that is part of the reason why we are waiting at the minute. So there's that. So in regards to the transfer policy, I'm actually just going to pull up Newcastle's transfers. Newcastle transfer history. All transfers. To give it a minute to load up. So obviously in the first season, Dan Ashworth actually wasn't here anyway. Of the PIF ownership, I mean. And in that season, obviously, the focus will have been keep the club in the Premier League. So that was the season of which season was that? Was that 20? It was sort of 22, 21, 22, wasn't it? I believe. Interesting. Sorry, I'm just. I maybe should have checked this beforehand. Just trying to figure out how this is because I can't see like Trippier and those signings on this for some reason. Is it not showing January transfers? It's not showing January transfers. Okay. Let's have a quick look. If I go into details, does that help? Arrivals. Here we are. So, obviously, in the first season, it was more important for us to stay in the league than it was to bring in youth players and stuff. And on top of that, Dan Ashworth wasn't there anyway. So it doesn't really surprise me that we didn't bring any youth players in that season. And I imagine it doesn't really surprise other people either. So obviously we brought in Trippier, we brought in Byrne, we brought in well, technically Willock was still under Ashley. We brought in Chris Wood and Bruno. Now I don't think anyone is really arguing with that first season thing, but I think it's kind of important just to go over what we did in each season to explain my point. Now, obviously, Bruno was brought in for around about 40 million. Chris Wood was like 25. Byrne was 13, so that's what 78. Trippier was 12. So you're talking we spent about 90 million in that first season. So just write that down. My calculations in a minute. And yes, this is going to end up coming back to PSR, which I talked about in my last video. So obviously we're moving into our second season where we brought in Isak, we brought in Gordon. Obviously that was in January. We brought in Botman, we brought in Target. We also brought in Garang Kuol, which I like to think was a Dan Ashworth signing. A very, very low risk signing who was always where it doesn't really matter per se if he becomes good enough for our first team, because we're still going to make money off him, which is more important in the long run really than it is for us to get young players in to the club who come into the first team. Now, obviously, it's nice to get young players coming into the first team, but financially speaking, and in regards to transfers, it doesn't actually matter that much. So yeah, so we spent 90 mil that first season in the January. So 60, 45, or 40, let's call it 40, 100, 135, 150. So we spent around about 150 million in that second season. And then that brings us to the final season, which obviously this current season, which we spent, I don't really have to add this up, but it was around about 150 million. So we spent about 52 on Tonali, about 40 on Barnes, 32 on Livramento, so that's what, 88 plus, so that's 130, plus a 5 or 6 mil on Minte, so 135. Hall doesn't matter for this, so we spent about another 135 million. Now, obviously, in one of my previous videos, I talked about how much money we can save over the next few weeks, how much we can save in the summer. Now that's great, and we have been doing that over the last season and the season before, letting players go who were past it, who were no good for us, and reducing the wage bill that way. Now, obviously, we haven't been able to sell anyone really. I think we brought in about 20 million or something in player sales, which obviously we all know, but it does reduce what we can do. Now, my opinion is it kind of comes back as well to the aims of the club, where I think our aim for the first season was to avoid relegation, obviously. And I think the club's aim for the second season was probably just top half, maybe Europa Conference League. Now, what was, and I think if that had been the case, what they would have done is probably have spent about 100 mil in the summer rather than 130 odd mil. And that 30 million there will have been allocated towards bringing young players in for Ashworth to spend. Now, also what you have to take into account, and this isn't money wise, is that in the Ashworth's Brighton contract, as is standard in business, there will have been like a non-competitive thing where he couldn't use the information from Brighton at Newcastle. So what that means is all the scouting that Dan Ashworth oversaw at Brighton he wouldn't have been able to use any of that to do new signings. Now, I imagine there's a little bit of leeway but basically, so what he will have been required to do is come into Newcastle and use Newcastle's player database, say, and use that to sign young players. Now, what he could do is bring in new scouts, etc., and have them get the same information as Brighton, which I believe is what he's been doing. But at the same time, Brighton are then a step ahead of us, so it doesn't matter. So obviously, he's been concentrating on setting up the recruitment side, which is fine. And I think in the summer, what would have happened is we would have spent slightly less on the first team because we wouldn't have required a team that can compete on four fronts, at least not to the same level. So we could have brought in these younger players, and those would have been, maybe some of them would have been used as squad players in the European Conference League. But when you're in the Champions League, you can't do that. So we had to spend more money to bring our squad up to a slightly higher level. Now, you can argue all day whether the signings were good enough or not. That's a different argument, but it still had to be done for the size of the squad. So, in my opinion, that's why we're not seeing the signings of youth players yet. Now, what I would imagine is this season coming, in the summer, we'll see 2 or 3 young players signed. Maybe one will go out on loan. Minte might come into the first team. And 1 or 2 will go out on loan, and maybe one other into the first team as a young player who gets brought in the summer to supplement any outgoings. So I can see us bringing in a younger striker. Maybe QO will be good enough, but from what I've seen of his loan spell out in Holland, he hasn't been doing that great, so I doubt that. But having said that, not every loan player has to excel to be able to come into our first team. Because it's not just about how they perform out on loan, it's how they how they grow as a player. And it might be that he can come in as a backup striker. Who knows? Anyway, my point is that I think this summer, especially if we don't get Champions League, which it isn't looking likely to, I think this summer we are more likely to go, right, we have a good squad. We can sell 1, maybe 2 players and bring in 1 or 2 first team quality players to replace them, but then using the rest of the summer budget to bring in more players. Now, that does obviously depend on the financial situation of the club. That's where I can see a player like Bruno probably being sold in the summer. Now, I realise that I said we didn't have to sell them, and I still stand by that. But I think we still will sell one. Not because we have to per se, but because we might still have to do it for that next big push, which is a different thing. We don't have to sell them, but to be able to keep them and make a push is a little bit more difficult because of the financial side of it. So that's my opinion on that. So basically, what I'm saying is the reason why Dan hasn't gone and signed youth players yet is 2 or 3-fold. Firstfold, the financial situation. Okay, obviously, we've discussed that before. No need to go into it again. Secondly, just the position that we were in as a club, where we had to go and sign more first team players, which cut into our budget. And the third reason is just that there probably wasn't the list of players that we needed to sign until he could get the scouting system sort of implement his system, which would hopefully be getting those players in a database for us to go and sign in the future. Now, that's my opinion on it. I'm sure there's probably other reasons to it, but I don't blame Dan Ashworth for this. I think it's just a situation of where the club is at, the scouting system, the financial situation, rather than his fault. So thanks for listening, guys. Just a small point on the Fulham game yesterday. Nice to be back to winning ways. So yeah, and hopefully we can continue that into our next game. In regards to the last few days of the January, if Almiron goes, I think we'll bring in another signing. Now, whether that will be a first teamer, I don't know. Obviously, Morgan Gibbs White is a rumour at the minute, which I think would be a good signing for us. But we shall see. So thanks for listening, guys. Like, subscribe, and I'll try and get my next video up maybe Tuesday, Wednesday, depending on work. And hopefully, this is a better quality than just being recorded on my phone. Cheers, guys, and I'll catch you later.